A few months ago, I wouldn't have guessed that my next DIY video would be personal protective equipment for a pandemic, but here we are. Before I get started, it should be noted that face shields like this and other PPE are preventative measures. They're not going to make anyone immune to the coronavirus. The best course of action for most people is the self-isolation, the social distancing, quarantine. But for real, keep your distance from others and wash your hands. So the model that I'm using is from Prusa. I'll put the link to the description. You should really check it out because there's a lot of useful information for how to put the mask together and how to sanitize the parts when you're done. So the files can be located under this tab here. And if you click on remixes, you'll find a lot of user contributions. So the community has really come together during this crisis to help things out. The model that I'm using is this version with the NIH visor. Since I don't have a laser cutter to pattern the transparent portion of the face shield, I have decided to create a stencil for basically patterning laminated sheets. So the dimensions are shown here just based on the dimensions provided by Prusa. You can see that this is just a kind of like 600 micron extrusion. And to create an STL out of this in Fusion 360, you just follow the process I'm showing here. So for the slicing, I prefer to use Prusa Slicer. Obviously you can use whichever slicing software you prefer. The bed of the Ender 3 that I am using for doing the printing is a little bit too small, so obviously you have to rotate it around to make sure that it fits appropriately. These are the print settings. If you're brand new to printing, you can borrow these, but most likely you have your own optimized set of parameters. I like to include them just in case someone's brand new. So once all that's done, you can just click the slice now. It will show the print paths and you can export the G-code under whichever file name you prefer. For communicating with the Ender 3 itself, I prefer to use Repetier host. So I just load in the G-code file and I hit the print button. And you'll see this is about a 20-ish minute print. And at the end, you just go ahead and peel up the part. So that was the bottom half for the transparent part of the shield. This is the top half. And again, we follow through the same process. Send it to Prusa Slicer, slice the part, send it to Repetier host, and print it. So this is an additional 20 minutes of printing. But I like this because they're fairly rigid and I can reuse them basically indefinitely. Printing the headband is pretty straightforward because basically all it is loading in that file that you downloaded from the Prusa website and hitting the slice button. I'm actually using the same print parameters I did for the previous print jobs. I'm using the same parameters for all of the prints in this video. But again, it's unoptimized, so this particular print takes 3 hours. The downside, of course, to having that visor on it, although it provides extra protection, is that you can't print more of these headbands on the same plate as easily. I found that the bottom reinforcement file that I got from Prusa doesn't fit very well with the thin laminating sheets I'm using for the transparent part of the shield. So I'm actually using 3D Builder, the emboss tool, to add little kind of additional bumps to these little pegs here for holding the transparent portion in place. So I actually find myself using 3D Builder fairly often for doing little quick edits to parts like this. Just bumping these out just a tiny bit to make it more secure. And then of course you can go and you can save it as an STL file. and then follow the same process as previously to send it over to Prusa Slicer, and then send it over to Repetier host. This is about 30-ish minutes. Creating the transparent shield portion. So the material that I'm using is thermal laminated pouches because I had them lying around, so this is Scotch brand. And you'll find that prior to putting them through the machine, the pouches are fairly opaque. They're pretty floppy, not really good on their own for using for a face shield, but after you put them through the machine, they actually come out quite transparent, obviously, because you want to be able to see whatever you're laminating, and their rigidity goes up. So at this point, actually, it is a pretty good material to use for the face shield. When putting everything together, I want to keep everything as clean as possible, so I just wipe everything down with a sanitizing wipe. These are the different portions that I'm assembling. And again, here is the process for using those stencils. So I just line them up, and I use a Sharpie to mark out the areas I want to either punch a hole or to cut out. And I'm being a little bit slow here, probably because I'm trying to be careful because I'm being recorded on video. So I'm just going to go ahead and speed through this. So that was the bottom half of the shield. This is the top half. So because I don't have a laser cutter, I'm using what I have on hand, which is leather hole punching tools. So that is one option, but I actually prefer this punch with a hammer. I find that it creates a fairly clean cut, and I can do it relatively quickly. In a second, I'll go through a process in which you don't need to use any punches at all. You can just use a razor blade. So these corners I end up just cutting with scissors. You could just use a razor blade for that as well. So next I'll just go through the assembly process. I like to do this just to make sure that the parts were created properly and that they fit together. So the holes should line up with those pegs fairly easily. You will require a little bit of force to fit them in, but you want that because it's basically being held in with tension. So there is the bottom reinforcement. And you can see that's the bulk of it now. For the strap, I'm using these elastic bands that I had purchased from Amazon a while ago for cosplay purposes. If you don't have something like this, you could just use rubber bands, but this is obviously more comfortable. So I'm going to cut little slots in this so that it can be adjustable. And now you can see how those little slots that I cut slide right onto those little pegs on the headband. And this is pretty much it. That is the fully constructed face shield. So if you don't have hole punches, you can get by with just a razor blade, and I'll quickly show you how to do that. All you really need to do is cut little X's where the holes are marked. And you just want to be careful not to cut yourself with the razor, and you want to make sure that those X's that you cut aren't too large. If you make them too large, there won't be enough tension in the transparent portion to hold itself onto the headband. I think if you do it a few times, you'll get the feel for it and you'll be able to kind of produce a ton of these in a relatively short period of time. Sanitizing and storing. I am using PPE while making these to avoid contamination, but just to be safe, I am cleaning them off with 95% ethyl alcohol. So here I'm just trying to spray to cover all of the surfaces. Keep an eye on the Prusa website because they are doing their own investigations for what cleaning methods are best. So I leave this coating to dry. I wipe away any excess with a clean paper towel. I apply a second coat and let that dry as well. Once that dries off, I flip everything over so I can put the same coating on the opposite side. So 2 coatings on each side. And of course wearing PPE gloves to prevent contamination during the whole thing. And at the end of all this, I assemble it, and you'll notice that I assembled this one incorrectly. The headband is upside down, but I guess that's what happens when you're on video. Once that's assembled, I store it in a sealed bag. So normally I'd be doing 5 to 10 in a batch, and I'd still store all of them in the same bag. So I keep them in separate bags basically to prevent cross-contamination. So I'll show you an example of a single batch of 5 in a sealed bag. That's right here. You can see that I labeled it with a date and a time so that if I send this to a hospital or to anyone else, they can set it aside for however long they deem necessary for it to be safe. And I stored it in a secondary bag, which was the trash bag that you just saw. But that's it. I'm trying to mass produce these to send to hospitals and others in need. You can see here I'm trying to print them out on my custom 500 by 500 millimeter printer. This way I can print multiple of these visor type of headbands in a single go overnight. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, stay indoors and stay safe.